Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here, and this time around I have the full field review for the new Nikon 500PF. For this lens, I did some local shooting and testing, but I also took it on a whirlwind trip to Custer State Park in South Dakota, to Yellowstone National Park, and then finished up with a couple days in Grand Teton National Park. During this time, this was the only lens I used, so I really got a feel for both its strengths and its weaknesses. Also, for the record, I'm not sponsored by anyone, nor did I receive any funding or discounts for the lens or for the trip itself. Everything was purchased at full price using my own funds, so there isn't a sponsor out there somewhere swaying my opinion. Now, with that in mind, if you would like to help support these gear reviews, the best way you can help is by passing my videos around to everyone and anyone who might be interested. Of course, if you want to subscribe to my YouTube channel and sign up for my free email newsletter on my site, I'd really appreciate that as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Build and features. First, let's talk build quality. The lens is, in my opinion, the same pro quality you'd find in the larger, more expensive primes. It feels rugged, and I accidentally discovered it can take some inadvertent abuse. It's also fully weather sealed, and when I was forced to put that to the test a few times, it performed flawlessly. As a side note, the 200-500 does not have the same level of weather sealing. The lens owes its small dimensions and lightweight to the phase Fresnel element on the inside. The Fresnel lens element is sort of like a small-scale version of the Fresnel lens you would see in most lighthouses. It basically takes the light rays and shortens and compresses them and allows you to have a 500mm focal length without the need for the lens to be physically 500mm long. As a quick comparison, here's the lens next to the 200-500, the 300PF, the 600 f4, and the 70-200 f4, all without hoods. Let's take a closer look at the lens. Starting from the front, we have the hood, which locks into place when you attach it. Just press the button to release. No worries about it falling off, as often happens with the 200-500 and even once with my 300PF. The front element is next, and it features a moisture and dust-resistant fluorine coating with a filter diameter of 95mm. Next, we have the function buttons. These allow for a variety of customizable options that we'll discuss here in a moment. Going down the barrel, we have the focus ring, and it feels solid and smooth, just like you would expect on an expensive prime. Minimum focus distance on the lens is 3 meters, and I know that has caused some complaints out there on the internet. Many people wish the minimum focus distance was a bit closer, like the 300PF's 1.4 meters or the 200-500's 2.2 meters. I too wish it focused a touch closer, but it hasn't been an issue for me yet, although I have been shooting mostly large mammals. Next, we have an assortment of switches, much like you'd find on a large prime. I'm going to go over them very briefly here, but if you'd like a lot more info, check out my ebook, Secrets to the Nikon Autofocus System. I have an entire chapter that tells you everything about every switch and every button found on modern Nikon lenses, and more importantly, how to get the most from them. For now, here's a very quick overview. Starting at the top, we have the AF option switch. For most shooters, I recommend the A/M option. The M/A option makes it too easy to accidentally bump the focus ring during AF operation and wind up in manual focus override mode. The A/M option forces you to move the AF ring much further before manual focus override engages. Next, we have the focus limiter option with a choice of full or 8 meters to infinity. This is pretty standard, although I really wish Nikon would take a cue from the third-party manufacturers and put in another limiter position designed for close focus work that prevents the lens from heading out to infinity. It would make working with small, close subjects much easier. Next, we find our VR options, normal and sport, and we're going to talk about those options more in the VR section of this review. Finally, we have a switch that we only see on higher-end lenses. This switch controls what the function buttons do at the front of the barrel. The first option is AFL, and by default, it locks your focus distance when you press any of the function buttons at the front of the lens. However, on higher-end cameras, you can actually program this for a variety of functions, such as using a preset focus point, switching AF area modes, disabling flash, and a whole lot more. On the other side, we have AF on, and this allows you to press any of the function buttons to engage autofocus. I seldom have found any need for this, but it's there. Finally, we have the middle option, memory recall, and that's the one I really like. This option allows you to set in a specific focus distance and then press one of the function buttons to make the lens go back to that distance. I find this incredibly handy when dealing with tough to focus subjects. In those situations, when you're focusing and refocusing, sometimes the AF system misses and then hunts, often causing a missed shot. So what I do is focus at about the same distance my subject is, I lock it in, and then when the lens decides to go hunting, I simply press one of the function buttons to get it back in the ballpark. Once focus is close, I find the camera has a much easier time latching on when I hit the AF on button to lock it in. Next is the collar, and that's a bit of bad news. As it turns out, I don't think it's very well designed, and if you're not careful, you'll find yourself walking along with just the foot in your hand and your camera and lens on the ground. In fact, that's exactly what happened to me in Custer State Park. Luckily, the lens and the D5 were fine, but here's what happened. Okay, I want to talk to you about a little problem I found with this lens. If you notice, I have the foot in my hand right here. My Wimberley quick release is on it, but if you notice, there's no lens attached to this anymore. Let me show you where the camera and lens are. They're down here at my feet. The reason they're down there is because they fell down there. I was carrying the lens by the foot, and that's how you're supposed to carry any lens that has a foot. You always carry it by the foot. That means that the weight is supposed to be supported here and not by the camera mount. So I was walking along with my fingers like this, just carrying this camera and lens setup, and it just slipped right off. The foot was right there and it just slipped right off onto the ground. Funny thing is, I had one of my subscribers tell me that that was a problem that they had discovered, so I tried to make sure the little safety knob here, or whatever it's called, was secure, and I thought that I had it reasonably tight. Well, I'm walking along, and apparently, you don't even feel yourself doing it, apparently my finger inadvertently hit this little foot release button right here, and I didn't realize that I was walking along and it just slipped off, hit the ground. So my advice is to replace this sucker as soon as you can. I'm sure Really Right Stuff or Kirk Enterprises or somebody's going to come out with a much better engineered version of this, and it'll have the Arca Swiss thing built into it. I would replace it as soon as you can, because this one is a little bit dangerous. Otherwise, make sure that you really tighten this to an unreasonable amount and be very careful. The other thing I would do is carry the camera like this, maybe even leave the foot off if you don't need it, and carry it by the lens and not by the foot, because like I say, mine just fell onto the ground. I had another subscriber, same thing happened, so be careful with it. Finally, wrapping up the build section, we end up at the metal mount, and you can see it features a rubber O-ring around the perimeter to help seal out dust and moisture between the body and lens. Handling. The small size and weight distribution of this lens just begs for hand-holding, and in fact, very seldom did I put the 500pf on a tripod. It just doesn't need one if you have an adequate shutter speed, which we'll talk about soon in the VR section. However, that's not the big story here. What I really love about shooting this lens is just how fast you can get yourself into tricky positions and places. Often when you encounter wildlife, you have to be fast if you want to get the shot. With this lens, I would time and again get myself into cool and unique positions just as the action started and consistently nail the shot. The importance of this just cannot be overstated. I think it's the best part of using this lens. This lens is so quick and flexible in the field that I was getting shot after shot that I 100% knew I would have missed with my normal 600 f4 mounted to a tripod setup. In fact, here's an example. Out in Yellowstone, we were fortunate enough to have spotted a nice red fox. As I shot, I kept thinking that there was no way I could have managed to get into position as fast as I needed with my tripod-mounted 600 f4. Time and again, I had to almost run to get into position and then get low and then fire just as he rounded the corner. Had I been messing with a tripod, I never would have captured as many shots. Had I been hand-holding the 600mm, I likely would have fatigued since it went on for so long. Of course, I would have captured some great images with the 600 f4 in that scenario too, but I'm confident that I actually captured more images and more poses because of the speed that I could maneuver with the 500pf. Like I say, the flexibility of this lens just cannot be overstated, and in my opinion, #1 reason to have it. The other thing I like about this lens is that I found myself taking it with me when I normally would never bring along a large telephoto. It's small and inconspicuous enough that it's easy just to grab and take along in case you see something. Of course, there were other circumstances during the trip where the 600 f4 would have been a much better choice, but I have to say, the versatility of this small, lightweight, handheld lens is the real reason it now has a permanent place in my bag. However, the 500pf is not without its downsides. The f5.6 challenge. To me, the major drawback with the 500pf is the fact that it's an f5.6 optic. Now, I fully realize that an f4 version would likely cost more than the current 500 f4, and of course, come in at a larger size and heavier weight. I get all of that. However, f5.6 often has some serious drawbacks, especially when compared to f4 and f2.8 glass, and I would be remiss in this review if I didn't discuss those. First, of course, is compared to f4 glass, you have to shoot at 1 stop faster ISO for the same shutter speed. I know many people dismiss this fact since today's cameras are so good, and I would tend to agree if that difference never got any worse than maybe ISO 400 versus ISO 800. However, when you shoot at the edge of day, you often find f5.6 is the difference between something like ISO 32 and 6400, or sometimes even ISO 6400 and 12800. So for wildlife shooters, that step really is significant. And by the way, I wrote an article you can find at my site that discusses in detail why high ISO can't replace fast glass. I think the reasons will actually surprise you. I'll put a link in the card above to the article so you can check it out. In addition, the other thing I noticed immediately was the lack of subject isolation compared to my f4 glass, and this is a big one, at least for me. Sure, when I was close to the subject, it looked great. In fact, I really like the way this lens renders. However, as I got further back, that depth of field of course increased, and I was definitely missing the subject isolation I normally have with my 600 f4. This was especially true if the backgrounds were close to the subject. They often look busier and more distracting than what I'm accustomed to with my f4 glass. Another problem with subject isolation is if the critter was just a little bit too far away and I wanted to crop a little. The increased distance meant more depth of field, which looks okay with the 600 f4, and it looks just kind of at the edge of acceptability with the 500 PF in my opinion. In addition to what was just mentioned, f5.6 was an issue with the 1.4 teleconverter, as you'll see next. Teleconverter performance. First, let's get sharpness out of the way. With the Nikon 1.4 TCE3 attached, Nikon claims there's no loss in sharpness, and if you look at this test with the bare lens versus the lens plus teleconverter, you'll see it really is quite close. From a sharpness standpoint, I wouldn't hesitate to use this lens with the 1.4 TC. However, there are several other problems I encountered while out in the field that I'd like to share. The first and most obvious is that if you're dropping to f8 when you slap on a teleconverter, in dim conditions, this puts your ISO through the roof. However, that's not really the worst of it. First, a little bit of background about me. One of the biggest problems I encountered has to do with the way I shoot. Whenever I can, before I choose my AF point, I compose the shot, and then I move the AF point to the eye, or as close as I can, making slight adjustments to the composition as needed, and then I fire away. This allows me to keep the AF point on the eye, and with my AF button constantly engaged, anytime the animal moves, those slight movements are compensated for by the AF system and I get consistently sharp eyeballs. I prefer this over using the center point and recomposing. When I do the focus and recompose thing, the animal often moves during the process, resulting in a slightly soft eye. The problem is that the AF system doesn't particularly care for f8 maximum apertures. First, you can only use a limited number of AF points, mostly located towards the center. In fact, any points that were not designed for f8 would cause it to hunt so frequently I almost went out and bought it an orange vest and a rifle. In addition, even with the f8 compatible AF points, I found the AF was noticeably slower and far less consistent than without the TC attached. Without the TC, AF was incredibly consistent and quick both on my D5 and D850. In the end, I missed enough shots with the TC that I started to avoid its use, often switching to the higher pixel density D850 for later cropping, and I hate cropping, so that really tells you something. As a side note, this is another reason why I like f4 and faster glass. You don't run into this AF issue when you attach a 1.4 TC, since you only drop to f5.6. There were more than a few times I almost grabbed my 600mm just to get the shot, but I wanted to force myself to find this lens's limitations, and this is one of them. Now, that said, in a pinch, the TC certainly gets the job done with nearly no loss of quality, especially if you're willing to focus and recompose, but it's definitely not my favorite way to go. VR performance. This lens features both sport and normal VR, and which to choose can get tricky. I usually use sport mode though, and here's why. I'm sure you've noticed that when you use VR, the image in the viewfinder can sort of float around a little bit, often jumping after you take the shot. This is due to the movement of the VR lens group, but it's more than just a quirky footnote. The problem is, when the image in the viewfinder is floating like that, you don't know for sure if your AF point is precisely where you think it is. I often have people complain to me that they absolutely know the AF point was on the eye of their subject, but when they look at the info display showing the AF position, it's not quite there. That's because when you look through the viewfinder, your VR group was engaged and it did appear as if the AF point was where it should have been. However, when you push down on the shutter release, the VR group recenters, shifting the image to a slightly different position. Sport VR helps keep that movement to a minimum for better AF point precision. However, it's not a set it and forget it setting, at least not with this lens. In my testing and field work, I found that under 1/250th of a second, I was way better off with normal mode, and it was only when I got above 1/250th of a second that I was able to really utilize sport mode. And by the way, VR modes are thoroughly covered in my Nikon AF book if you'd like more info. Now, let's look at some of those VR tests. Now, as it turns out, this is the trickiest part of the review, at least for me. I had heard internet rumblings about the lens having an issue with VR around the 1/25th of a second mark, and that there was some concern about it underperforming. So I did a series of tests where I tried a variety of different configurations and shutter speeds. I'm going to simply summarize the results here, though, since there were well over 700 shots involved. In addition, I used VR almost constantly in the field as well, so I think I have a handle on it. Also, keep in mind that since this is a VR test, there is a variable at play, and that's my ability to hold the lens steady. What works or doesn't work for me may not fully apply to you. Also, during these tests, I compared the 300pf and 200 to 500 zoom to kind of get an overall idea of how this performs. I started with a number of back and forth tests with different targets in one-stop increments from 1/30th of a second to 1/500th of a second in both normal and sport VR modes. My hit rate at 1/30th of a second was a big fat goose egg with every lens and every VR mode. I just can't keep anything steady hand holding at those speeds, period. Now let's talk about the shutter speeds everyone is worried about, the 1/60th to 1/25th of a second range. I can tell you that between 1/60th and 1/25th, things got better with all the optics over what I was seeing at 1/30th of a second. The thing is, I was getting okay sharpness at those speeds, but not quite the biting sharpness I was seeing at higher speeds. Now, I think part of it might be that it's just a little bit difficult to handle a 500mm lens at that speed, but I think there also might be slightly more to it as well. I tried the same shutter speed test, but from a tripod with a loose gimbal head. In those tests, with VR set to normal, I found I had actually more sharp images at 1/60th than 1/25th of a second, and the opposite should be the case. The difference in sharpness was slight, but the overall trend was kind of evident. When set to sport mode with the tripod setup, I found that the 1/60th and 1/25th of a second range were about the same. That said, with VR turned on and the lens mounted to a loose gimbal head, my keep rate was far higher than I can get by just hand holding, even when I'm braced firmly against something. So I think movement on the part of the photographer at least plays a small role here in that shutter speed range. So I hate to be all inconclusive with this, but my feeling about it is that there just doesn't seem like there's like a super big 1/60th to 1/25th of a second problem in that shutter speed range. Certainly not like what we saw with the 300pf. Now, once I got to 1/250th of a second, things started to get better, and this jives with what I found out in the field. Careful hand-holding at 1/250th and higher, for me, put a bunch of sharp images on the card. While field testing, I also noticed the VR system in this lens seems to work well even if your shutter speed is high. With the 200 to 500 and 300pf, I've noticed that if I allow the shutter speed to climb over 1/500th of a second, I frequently see some of the images display a loss of acuity and sharpness. With this lens, and coincidentally, my 600 f4e, I find that I don't see it nearly as often, especially in sport VR mode. In fact, I actually never saw a drop in sharpness once in the high-speed test series with the 500pf, where I saw it multiple times with the 200 to 500 and 300pf with VR engaged. However, in the field, I think there were maybe a few times that a higher speed with VR cost me just a touch of acuity, but I want to stress that it was only very occasionally. The reason being able to shoot high shutter speeds with VR matters is that when a static scene turns into an action scene and you crank up your shutter speed real quick, it's very easy to forget about VR. I do it all the time. But with this lens, you'll still grab a boatload of crazy sharp images. To me, this more than outweighs the possibility of maybe a little bit of erratic performance in the VR system in the 1/60th to 1/25th of a second range. By the way, my advice with this lens is just to try to keep it at 1/250th of a second or faster when hand-holding, and just use sport VR when you need it. I use manual plus auto ISO, so I simply set my f-stop to where I want it, usually 5.6. Then I set my shutter speed somewhere at 1/250th of a second or faster, and then I let the camera float the ISO. That way, I never have to worry about the shutter speed dropping too low. Plus, I find that 1/250th of a second is like a nice safe shutter speed when the animal is less than perfectly still. AF speed and accuracy. Another online concern with this lens, and one of my concerns as well, is AF speed. The good news is that it's way better than you think. From a field standpoint, I never once thought it was too slow, as I often notice when shooting my 200 to 500. I always found it up to the task, even for action. Once I got home, I found out why. I did some side-by-side speed tests, and I have to say, the results were very surprising. In these tests, I captured a video of the AF rings moving on the various lenses, and then counted the frames in the video where the focus ring was in motion to determine the actual time it took to focus. In addition, I did two different tests. The first test was the entire focal range for each comparison lens. This simulates the kind of time it may take if the lens starts hunting. I also did a test at 5 meters to infinity to see how close the speeds are if you maybe need to switch from one subject to another at some of the typical focus distances we encounter with wildlife. Let's go over those results. For the 500 PF versus the 600 f4E, it was neck and neck all the way. For the full range test, both lenses ran the entire range in 0.4 seconds. For the 5 meter to infinity test, the 500 PF actually scooted past the 600 f4 with a time of 0.33 versus 0.4 seconds. Of course, you got to remember the 600 f4 had to compete starting from its minimum focus distance, giving the 500 PF a slight head start. Still, I was more than a little impressed with those results. Next, I pitted it against the 300 PF. For the full range test, the 300 PF pulled it off in exactly 0.5 seconds, coming in behind the faster 500 PF's time of just 0.4 seconds. The 300 PF does focus a bit closer, however, so that may have influenced it. For the 5 meter to infinity tests, things were reversed, with the 300 PF's time coming in at 0.16 seconds versus the 500 PF's time of 0.33 seconds. Next, the 500 PF versus the 200 to 500. For the full range test, once again, we have 0.4 seconds for the 500 PF, and the 200 to 500 comes in at over double that speed at 0.83 seconds. Coincidentally, this is slightly slower than the 500 PF with a 1.4 teleconverter attached. For the 5 meter to infinity test, once again, the 500 PF comes out on top with a time of 0.33 seconds versus the 200 500 time of 0.5 seconds. If you were wondering if there was a difference in AF speed between the 500 PF and the 200 and 500, there absolutely is, and it's very noticeable in the field. For the other optics, they were too close to really tell the difference in the field, at least for me. Now, the other aspect of this is AF accuracy. Speed is nice, accuracy is better, and this lens doesn't disappoint. I was very happy with this lens's ability to quickly obtain a positive, precise AF lock over and over. It seemed as good as my 600 f4 in this respect, and after shooting it a few days, I was confident that if I had an AF lock and I had sufficient shutter speed, that I'd have a tack sharp image on the card. This proved true over and over during the test. Basically, it just gets the shot. Sharpness comparison and rendering. Okay, now the part you've been waiting for, the sharpness testing. For these tests, I compared the 600 f4, the 300 PF, the 300 PF with a teleconverter, and the 200 to 500 all wide open. First, let's get one thing out of the way. These are all fantastic optics, and center sharpness between all the optics is very close. Try as I might, I just don't see what I would call a significant difference between these optics in the center of the frame. If you're only concerned about center sharpness, then I'd consider them pretty much all equal. The real story starts when you head towards the side of the frame. As you can see, the 600 f4 and the 500 PF are so close, I'm just going to go ahead and call it a tie here. This mirrors what I thought in the field as well, especially for close subjects. For further subjects in the real world, I still kind of feel like I'm getting a touch better sharpness with the 600 f4, but only by a very small margin. The 300 PF is next, and in this case, the 500 PF does seem to have a small advantage. Also, note that my 300 PF is slightly decentered, so the right side is sharper than what you see on the left. Still, overall, I think the 500 PF does enjoy a slight edge. Next, add a TC to the 300 PF, and the 500 PF easily pulls ahead. Not only is the 500 PF sharper, but it's also not showing the chromatic aberration we see with a 300 PF plus TC combo. So if you're thinking of a 300 PF and a TC versus like a 500 PF, I'd say go 500 PF if you think the TC is going to be used more than 50% of the time. Finally, the 200 to 500. The first thing I noticed when testing this lens is that it exhibits some focus breathing at close range. When I first did these tests, I placed the 200 to 500 on the tripod I had just used with the 500 PF, and as you can see, it has less magnification from that distance. Of course, the 200 to 500 focuses a bit closer, so if you can move up, it's not an issue. At a distance, the two lenses are pretty darn close. As for the sharpness tests, no surprise here. As you can see, although the 200 to 500 isn't bad, it just can't stand up to the prime. And again, that's not a surprise. It's not bad, but the prime easily beats it as you get towards the sides. And the 200 to 500 is also showing some degree of chromatic aberration as well, right? You can see it right along these black edges. Now, many people are quick to dismiss these edge problems since the subject is often more towards the middle anyway. However, dead center compositions get boring pretty quickly. If you like to do things like compose your photos or shoot verticals, then you'll probably welcome the additional sharpness towards the edges that the 500 PF brings to the equation, especially if you're shooting full frame. As for rendering, I know that's a very subjective quality. In the field, I felt that for the most part, I liked the way this lens rendered backgrounds and handled the transition between the sharp and the soft areas of the photo. This was especially true for closer subjects. In fact, up close, I think I like the rendering of this lens every bit as much as my 600 f4. Now, I've also had a lot of people ask for comparisons between the background rendering of this lens versus the 200 to 500, so I did a few tests all wide open. In going over these images, I'm not seeing a huge difference. Side by side, I can definitely pick out the 500 PF, and the background looks just a touch smoother and nicer to me. However, it's very close to be sure. Recommendations. Although the lens isn't perfect, I think the benefits far outweigh any shortcomings. I personally plan to use this lens in conjunction with my 600 f4e. I'll use it as my quick shot lens in the truck for when I need to jump out and grab a shot, and I'll likely use it when I'm doing longer hikes and I don't want to lug around that 600 f4e and the tripod and have that over my shoulder for miles on end. However, it certainly won't replace the 600E. I'll probably still use that lens for 70 to 80% of my shots. However, when you need something faster to use, this lens is a no-brainer. So if you're a fast prime shooter, I wouldn't ditch your big glass for it, nor would I buy this instead of one of the big lenses. The only exception, of course, is if maybe you simply can't physically handle the larger optic. For big prime shooters, I think of this more as an addition than a replacement. Now, I think there's another group of people looking at this lens, and they're also looking at the 200 to 500 and wondering if this lens is worth the extra money. Now, based on my experience with both, I take this lens just about every time over the 200 to 500. It's more rugged, it's fully weather sealed, it includes the function buttons, which I find incredibly useful, has faster AF, is sharper towards the edges, is lighter, smaller, and in my opinion, it's just more fun to use. Of course, the 200-500 is also a zoom, so if you need a zoom for what you do, that's probably a better way to go. If you're considering this versus a 300 PF or a 300 PF with TCs, I'd say it depends on both the type of camera, crop or full frame, and the distance to your typical subject. If you're shooting full frame, I'd say pretty much go for the 500 PF and don't look back. The 300 PF is often a bit short on full frame and ends up married to the teleconverter. However, if you're shooting a crop camera and frequently find 300mm to 400mm is enough, then the 300 PF is likely a better choice, plus one stop faster when you don't have the teleconverter attached. But again, this all depends on your subject distance. Okay, so there you have it. So as you can tell, I definitely like the lens. I've enjoyed using it, and I do actually highly recommend it. I think it's a really great little optic. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, make sure you check out my educational materials as well. I just recently came out with a video that shows my noise reduction method, and honestly, for noise reduction, I just use Photoshop and Lightroom. Take a look at it. I think you're going to like it. There's a lot of tips and tricks in there. Also, make sure you check out my ebook, Secrets to Setting Wildlife Photography and Secrets to the Nikon Autofocus System. Both are jam-packed with information. I know you're going to love it. We have thousands of people who've already bought these books and are using the techniques in them every day out in the field. And finally, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel and head over to my site, sign up for my free email newsletter. I'd love to have you on there. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.